So ahead of our seed sowing marathon, I thought today we would have a quick chat about compost. Now, if you've been following for a while, you probably already know that I don't use seed sowing compost just because it's so expensive and I find it holds on to water too much and can encourage damping off. So you often ask me, what is my favourite compost for seed sowing? Now, the honest answer is I don't have one, and I'll tell you why. The most important thing with compost is that it's fresh. So number one, you need to buy it from a place that's got a high traffic volume. So what I mean is the compost has not been sitting around for too long. You don't want to buy it from somewhere that doesn't really sell compost normally, even if it's cheap. If it's been left out in the rain, it will become waterlogged. And if it has been left somewhere dry, the compost will dry out. And you'll probably know from this summer how hot it was, how difficult it is to rehydrate compost once it's fully dried out. So you want somewhere that sells a lot of compost so that it's always coming in fresh and it's not been sitting there for a long time. So the same rules once you get it home will apply. Please don't stockpile your compost and get enough in that's going to last you for the next year. Just get enough in that's going to last you for the next couple of months during the grow along. Use it all up. I will have to buy new in January for the spring grow along, and I'll use up anything that's left from the autumn jump starter to plant up my bulbs. So you've got your compost, and I also like to add some horticultural grit to my compost. It's just because it makes the mix a bit heavier, and because compost can be quite light, especially when it dries out, and it adds a bit of extra drainage. So if you do accidentally overwater your trays, it does help a little bit, but it's not essential. If you can't get hold of any grit or you don't want to, you absolutely don't have to. I'm just explaining to you why I add it, and if you want to copy, you can. We've got our multi-purpose compost here. You can see it's fresh. It's still full of moisture, so it's not dried out, it's not waterlogged. This is our horticultural grit. Now, if you can't find the grit locally, it's really heavy. So if you can't find it locally, but you'd still like to add something for drainage, then you can just go with perlite. It's really light, so you can happily order that one online. Now, the purpose of the compost, as well as giving physical support to the seedling to hold it upright, otherwise if it was just in water it would fall over, wouldn't it, is to also hold air and water within the compost, ready for the seedling's roots to take it whenever it needs it. If you overwater your seed tray, the balance is out and you have more water than you have air. And if your seed tray dries out, the balance is shifted and you've got more air than water. Ideally, you want the balance to be about 50-50. Now I can see you're probably nodding at the screen and saying, and nutrients, Zoe? Not so much. You don't need to worry about nutrients for seedlings. Seeds have everything they need already stored within that seed coat to get off to a really good start. We don't really need to worry about feeding until later on when they've turned into plants and they've exhausted all of the nutrients that were in the compost. So to start with, we will only be watering them with plain water, no plant food at all. And it needs to be tap water. Please don't use water from your water butts if you've got any in there at all anyway, or from reservoirs, because that can have pathogens in them and that could cause your seedlings to get damping off disease. So we've got our 40 cell tray and our rigid bottom tray, because frankly I have never thrown one of these away. Now this looks lovely and clean and pristine. This is just for the video. They generally do not look like this. I use mine over and over and over again. Emptied my compost into my potting tray, and then I'm going to add some horticultural grit. I would say probably about 5% horticultural grit. Just give it a good mix. I'm going to use the scoop in a second. Give it a good mix, and what you want is just a generally good distribution of the horticultural grit through the compost, so you can see it, but there aren't any big lumps of compost or grit either way. There we go. I'm going to use the scoop rather than my hands, and I'm just going to mix it in like the recipe. If you need to add a bit more grit, then do so. I think it's looking pretty good. I couldn't bring myself to dirty my prop tray, so I'm going to use a recycled tray. I've given it a very good brushing over with this dustpan brush to make sure that there's no compost really left. That's fine. I've never had any problems with it whatsoever. So just get rid of the most of the compost. Wet compost is what would hold on to diseases, and then turn the trays over and just double check that you don't have any. They look like little cotton wool balls, which indicates that's pest eggs. Just double check to make sure that you haven't got any of those on the underneath of your trays. I don't, that's absolutely fine. So these are now ready to use again. So I'm just going to fill my 40 cell tray with compost. Now you can wash your trays if you want to. I just don't. They are nicer to use if they're clean, but I've got too many to do. And they've been baking in the shed all summer long, so I'd be very surprised if any pests or diseases were able to survive that anyway. So I'm really piling the compost on top so that I can firm it down with my fingers and make sure that we knock out any air pockets. If you've got a lot to do, one of these little tampers are very handy, because compost is quite abrasive and you will end up with quite dry hands by the end of the day. So when you're filling a seed tray, you want to firm the compost down just to make sure that you knock out any big air pockets that might be there. But don't firm it so much that you end up compacting the soil and then knocking out all of the air spaces between the soil particles.